Hi everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about event stakeholder management. This is going to be looking at how we manage the different stakeholders and people involved or impacted by any event that we might run. So, some of the learning outcomes for today is to define what the key terms are within event stakeholder management, list key stakeholders in events management, who are they? And to describe strategies for managing stakeholders. So what is it we do to ensure we manage everyone's issues or desires for the event in an effective way? So before I start, today's session is actually based quite a lot on a brand new book that's just come out. I'll put a link in the description below. It's called Event Stakeholders, Theory and Methods for Event Management and Tourism. It's Van Niekerk and Getz, if I pronounced that correctly. So it's just come out 2019, so I'll put a link below. But it's well worth it if you're interested in reading further around this subject. So, on to the session for today, which is let's start by defining the key terms in stakeholder management. So what are these key terms? First of all, what is a stakeholder? Well, it's any individual or group who can affect a firm's performance or who is affected by the achievement of the organisation's objectives. Of course, you could insert or replace some of those words with event in our context. But this was a quote from Freeman, who's one of the big researchers and founding sort of theory around stakeholder management from 1984. In further work, he went on to say that those groups who are vital to the survival and success of the corporation. Again, thinking about it in the context of events, there are many stakeholders who support and ensure that the events that we run are successful and sustainable. So that's kind of the initial definition of what stakeholders are. Breaking down different stakeholders, you have internal stakeholders. These are the persons involved inside the event or its organisation. So these tend to be the event manager. So it could be yourself if you're sat there listening to this as an event manager. It could be the staff that work for your organisation, your event company, the volunteers that you use at events, or perhaps some key advisors. So these are people who are internal stakeholders. And then we have external stakeholders, who are people external to our organisation or event. So people that are perhaps not employed on a day-to-day basis, but do have an interest and some power over the event. So people like the local community, the suppliers to the events, regulators, and general public. So these are people who are involved in the event to some degree, but are not part of the organisation that's delivering the event itself. Another term that we may come across is primary stakeholders. So a lot of researchers over the years have used the internal external terms for stakeholders, but then Clarkson went further to define stakeholders as primary stakeholders, who are those that have a direct stake in the organisation and its success. So you might imagine that they have some kind of economic or social connection to the event that's taking place. They're primary stakeholders. Beyond that, secondary stakeholders, Clarkson says that they are those who have a public or special interest stake in the organisation. So, it's people that are perhaps not necessarily within the inner sphere of the event organisation, but are involved somewhere along the line. So that's secondary stakeholders. Further to this, active stakeholders can be defined as those, and this was further work from Ponsford and Williams in 2010. Active stakeholders want to be involved and therefore require a variety of engagement efforts, from public meetings to inclusion on the board of directors. So people who are actively involved in the events, they would fall onto this list. And of course the opposite of active would be passive. So passive stakeholders just want to be kept informed, necessitating attention to the various media that can be best to reach them, and to two-way communication channels. So people on the sort of periphery of the event, not necessarily in the inner circle of the team that's organising the event. So these are passive stakeholders. So there's some of the sort of terms that we may come across, and these of course have been researchers and publishers over the years who've come across these and generated these terms. But it really, one of the reasons I'm sure that you're watching this video is to understand the process of stakeholder management. So in the Van Niekerk and Getz book, they propose a model for continuous planning process for stakeholder management, as it's called. So this is what it looks like. So first of all, there would be a process. Let's start at the top. There'd be a process of identifying stakeholders, both internal and external mapping. So that could almost be a bit of a brainstorming, really, and this will differ from event to event. So you'll know who are the stakeholders for your event. So it'll be a process of making a list. And if you wanted to put them into lists of internal, external, active or passive, primary or secondary, then that would be absolutely fine. So these are just ways of categorizing different stakeholders. So once that list is complete, we're going to go through some of these processes later on in this video, but there'll be sort of analysis and prioritize those stakeholders. So who are the most important and who are the ones that we need to pay most attention to? So there's various tools to do that. One of which I'll talk about is SWOT analysis. Thinking about people's needs and expectations is very important as well. The next step will be to formulate strategies. So how do we engage and defend against or inform or monitor all of these stakeholders based on the way in which we've prioritized them? Following on from that, we obviously then want to engage in two-way communication and with the stakeholders. That can either be just a flow of information, or it could be that we're actually collaborating with the various stakeholders. And finally, as with all of these cylindrical models, there's a monitor and evaluation step before we kind of repeat back to the start again. So for any event that's happening each year, no doubt there will be a review after the event and in preparation for the year ahead. So, at that point, that would be a good idea to review how the relationship with stakeholders has gone and the process that you've been through. So that is roughly the kind of subject headings that we're going to talk through today based on this model. So let's start with the first one, which is to identify stakeholders. Now, we mentioned some of the different types at the start of this video. Now here is a list of groups or perhaps of stakeholders who would be, in fact this is probably more towards maybe arts and festival events, but certainly it's general enough that would suit most events out there. So in the centre you might have event tourism organisations. They are, as I mentioned, the internal stakeholders. So these are all the people that are in the organisation. You have facilitators, who could be funding and marketing bodies or sponsorships. So these are people that help the event to sort of happen, essentially. You have suppliers and venues. You have partners or producers of other events. So these could be people that are working within maybe the portfolio of events, so like similar events or maybe even competition. Regulators, so these are the people that will be able to stop your event if you are not adhering to various laws and regulations. Allies and collaborators, I should say. Allies and collaborators. These are people that we would consider friends and people that you would collaborate with on your events. The impacted, so this is where local residents, local communities come in. And finally, managers of complementary event portfolios. And I'll come back to talk about that one later on. So again, this is an academic model. This is by Getz, Anderson and Larson from 2007. Sorry. So what I've done and what I thought would be useful is to work through a bit of an example through each of these sections, so you can kind of get an idea of the kind of people that would fall into it. Obviously, you'll know your events, and it'll be down to you to try and understand or make that list initially and categorize them, perhaps using this model. So A worked example I've come up with is a local music festival. It's a fairly general music festival. It's no specific. It's not related to any real world event that I would care to mention, but it is certainly one that perhaps is relevant to you. So, internal stakeholders, as I've mentioned, be people. Let's say for example, like the festival directors, employees that are helping with the festival, so full or part-time, and volunteers at the festival. So these are some good examples of internal stakeholders. Moving on to the facilitators. So we have here people. These are people, remember, who are really going to help the event happen, and but also actually have a lot of power to stop the event from happening at all. But so local government nearly always has a tremendous amount of power, but they can help with things like funding and venue space. Most, obviously, local music festivals, unless it's taking place on private land, will take place on publicly owned land. You could have an elected politician with a cultural portfolio. So I've experienced this, where there is a elected politician, perhaps often is driving or prohibiting events from taking place, depending on a local policy. We could also maybe have some Arts Council funding. Funding is a big facilitator, so that is a stakeholder we would want to manage closely. And on to then next is suppliers and venues. So a little bit connected to facilitators, but you might find that you're hosting your festival in a local park space, but that's going to be operated by council wardens. So these are people that are separate from perhaps the management of the council, but are the people local on the ground, and often they can be extremely useful in helping the event to take place. Perhaps you have to work with the local council finance team because of funding, or because you have to pay the council a higher fee for using the space. Maybe your stage supplier. That would be one supplier you'd have for a festival. You would also have some sound and lighting, or security suppliers. So, and then again, this list could go on. Obviously, have a limited amount of space on one slide, but appreciate that there are an awful lot of suppliers that would supply someone like a festival, and they would all be important stakeholders that you would have to consider. Producers or events, or I've put co-producers there so that you can better understand that actually it could be partners that you're working with. So the example I've given here is a local dance group who is helping to run a second stage at our music festival. Or we could also have local artistic partners helping to curate the festival. So they're booking acts and helping to promote the event. So they have the creative input. So these are people that we need to work with. And on to regulators. So I kind of mentioned earlier, but they are, the kind of people that will oversee the safety and legal compliance of your event. So people like local government building services teams, environmental health officer, always very important, who will come and do inspections for food and safety. Licensing department, if that's relevant in where you live, then you will have to apply for a license for the event. In the UK, there is the UK Licensing Act 2003. So most county councils or councils will have a licensing department that you'll need to work with. The police and the fire service. So these are key stakeholders who will help with your event, or potentially stop the event if they feel there's a risk to public safety. Allies and collaborators. So this doesn't necessarily have to be other events, but it could be people who support your event. So, media support from a local newspaper. This is my example again. I've also got local radio for media support. I also thought local influencers on social media, which is becoming an increasingly popular way of promoting events. So contacting influencers. And finally, any tourism marketing organisations that are local. So, these are organisations that are responsible for promoting visitor numbers, visitors to a particular place. So, very important. Onto the impacted. Now, this can always be one of the most controversial stakeholders to have to manage. Local residents near to the festival site. Now, depending on the relationship that the festival has with the local residents, can often mean a festival has to move or stay at the same site. So managing them and keeping them happy and contented, very important. Attendees, of course, are heavily impacted by the event, and also local businesses. So businesses that are near or around the festival site will certainly be impacted by the extra footfall traffic that's brought by the festival. And finally, managers of complementary event portfolios, so other local agencies for leisure, arts and culture, not-for-profit organisations who might have an interest in your festival, or maybe a local live music venue. I thought maybe they would be a stakeholder who'd be interested in a local music festival. So, it's people or organisations that operate events or event portfolios of a similar nature to this festival, who might have some cross collaboration or cross promotion, may be useful and of benefit. So that's a kind of worked example. I hope that's been useful in terms of understanding who might come under some of those lists. The next step, once you have your list, is to map the stakeholders and do some analysis and to prioritise. So the way in which I'm going to suggest doing this is using Mendelow's matrix, which is quite old now, as you can see, from 1981. It's been adapted in various forms over the years, but essentially it works on two axes. So you have first axis, which is a level of interest by individual stakeholders from low to high, and you have a level of power from low to high again, and that level of power is their ability to influence or force their level of interest onto the event in a good or a negative way, of course. So these two axes then form 4 quadrants. So we have, first of all, stakeholders who would fall into, who have a low level of interest and a low level of power, and we would refer to them as needing the minimal effort in terms of management. So they don't need too much managing. We'll come back again to our worked example in a second, which I hope will kind of highlight how this works. In the second box, we have people who have a high level of interest in the event but a low level of power. So these are people that we need to keep informed. Thirdly, people who have a low level of interest but a high level of power, and these are people that we need to keep satisfied. And finally, people with a high level of interest in the event and a high level of power, and we refer to those as our key players. So the purpose and use of this matrix in order to analyse your stakeholders is to imagine that you have your long list of stakeholders. You then take this list and you are now going to put each stakeholder into one of these 4 boxes, and that is then your kind of way forward in terms of managing that list of stakeholders, if that makes sense. So if we go back to our worked example, which is the local music festival. So first of all, let's have a look at minimal effort. I haven't put all of them into these boxes, but just as, for example, local agencies for leisure, arts and culture, they have a low level of interest, perhaps and a low level of power, so we would use minimal amount of contact with them. And I'll talk about ways in which we can do that in a second. In the keep informed box, I've put the local influencers on social media and your stage supplier. These are people with a high level of interest in the event, but not necessarily have the power to influence the success or failure of the event. This is all quite subjective, I must admit. So this is a way of demonstrating your thought and analysis, and you will need to make judgment on your event and your own stakeholders when you do this. But in the third box, I've put local residents and environmental health officer. These are people that have maybe a lower level of interest in the events, but do have a significant amount of power in helping for the event to succeed or to not go ahead. And finally, in the key players box, I've put there's our festival directors and of course our local dance group who are running the second stage, both of which have high levels of interest in the event and a high level of power to help the event happen, or indeed to stop it. So if they didn't do their jobs or what they were there to do. So you would then take the rest of your stakeholder list and then populate this grid to try and demonstrate, where each of the different stakeholders falls. Now, that's one way of representing it in this matrix, just writing it as a list like that. There is another way of doing it, which is to sort of map on dots here. Now, actually, I prefer this method simply because it allows you more variability in terms of where you put the dots. So rather than just be quite general, again, I've not put all of the stakeholders from our example on here, but you can see it does allow for you to say show some difference in terms of the level of interest and level of power that each stakeholder has. So you map it onto this grid based on those two axes that you can see. And I've put there, the festival director, for example, has a higher level of interest than perhaps the local dance group and a higher level of power. Now, that wasn't necessarily represented on the last version, on the slide before this, but it is here. So, I kind of like this way. I kind of think this shows a little bit more detail, how you kind of analyse your stakeholders. So once we've done that, obviously we need to think about how to formulate strategies. How are we going to deal with the different stakeholders? Now, I mentioned earlier about SWOT analysis, and Van Niekerk do advocate using SWOT analysis to think about your stakeholders. So you could run through each stakeholder and do SWOT analysis on them. So thinking about certainly in terms of stakeholder strengths. I'm assuming that you are familiar with what a SWOT analysis is, by the way, before you've watched this video. Their ability and potential to help or harm our event, their desire and ability to resist or oppose our efforts. So that can be think about that for strengths. In terms of stakeholder weaknesses, you think about where are they vulnerable and are they subject to the same forces and trends as us. Stakeholder opportunities, will they collaborate with us, and what can they do to help? Well, can we work with them? What are the opportunities? And finally, stakeholder threats. So are they a competitor, and what can they do that we can't? So, stakeholder, it is possible to do, SWOT analysis is a great tool, and it is possible to do a SWOT analysis on individual stakeholders, as you can see there. So once you have thought about what kind of strategy, I'm going to come back to the Mendelow matrix really, because in terms of thinking about how you'll deal with each stakeholder, I want to talk about each of the quadrants in turn and think about the kinds of things that we would do in terms of engaging with them. So we're now in the process of that, thinking of that two-way communication with these people. So how in each of those four quadrants we need to do different things to communicate with them. So first of all, the quadrant that was minimal, they have a low power and low interest. So here's some examples of things that you could do that would keep them informed. So it's things like, event information, your website's information section, having an email list that they can go and sign up to, and publishing press releases in the local media or news. So, these stakeholders would get their information through these sources. And because they have low interest, there isn't the need to constantly communicate with them. Now on to the next quadrant, which is the keep informed section, which have low power and high interest, as you remember. And here's some ideas of how we might communicate with them. Now, there is crossover between these different quadrants. I should point that out. It's by no means a definitive list either. I'd love to, hear your ideas on additional things they could do here. But for those that have low power and high interest, again, the information section on your event website would be good. Having an email list that they can sign up to, and the local media, all good things. But you might need to go a step further because this group has a higher interest. So things like local community meetings. So if we use our example of a local music festival, then we would need to maybe engage with these stakeholders in meetings before the event takes place, so they have an understanding about what it will entail. And maybe we could also do a frequently asked questions section on the website. That might be different or the same as the information section, but frequently asked questions, if you find that stakeholders are regularly communicating questions, then having somewhere where you have a kind of an answer that they can easily find would be very useful. So that's some of the things that you could do. Of course, there would be many more, but some of the things you could do for the keep informed section. For keep satisfied section, who have high power but a low interest in the events. Again, I've included the information section on the website or an email list as useful tools to keep them informed, but because they have high power, there is a different level of engagement needed, and perhaps these people need to be in attendance at key meetings, for example safety advisory group meetings. So it's important people who have a lot of power need to come to the meetings to ensure that they're informed and that they've had input into the process. One-to-one emails with them for crucial information. So particularly people like environmental health officers or police or the fire appreciate that kind of level of detail. And I've also found that over the years, phone calls to personalise and smooth, inverted commas, smooth the processes along a little bit, sometimes that helps. So having a personal touch with a group like this can make all the difference to the success of an event. And finally, key players. So these are people with high power and high interest in the event. So these are the kind of people, the event directors in our example, and they will need consultation on all key decisions around the event. They'll need to be involved in regular meetings. It could be weekly or monthly, depending on the time to the event. Again, one-to-one emails for crucial information, and never underestimate the power of picking the phone up and smoothing a process over, or personalising any decision, and talking and communication can help an awful long way. So these are potential strategies for dealing with the key player section. So finally, the final step would be to monitor and review the whole process. Now, I haven't got any further slides on this, purely because evaluating and monitoring event is probably a section in its entirety on its own. What it's important to remember is that the process of stakeholder management is included in that as sort of a way of understanding how well it went, how were there any problems, and can we reflect on those? How might we have done things differently? Could our communication have been better or worse with particular groups? So particularly for events that happen on a yearly basis, or certainly routine and regular, this process is really important, because understanding where things went wrong, so monitoring things like the number of complaints, monitoring the number of questions, the number of emails that come through from various stakeholders is really, really important way of monitoring if you've been successful in managing stakeholders successfully. So I hope that's been useful. I'll finish with a short slide, which is the references that I've used in this talk. So you can go away and have a look at some of the work that I have used. Now, I hope that's been useful, and look forward to presenting another video to you soon. Thanks a lot.